The joke in China is Kung Fu as a way to trick 13-year-old boys into meditating. Bruce had started his martial arts path as a punk. From this instant forward he would speak and think more and more like a Taoist monk. Taoism and Kung Fu served as a psychological self-corrective water to douse the flames. Because he was a dragon, a fire element. I am a horse and an earth element. Fire, horse and an earth element, apparently. Okay, here's some more information here. Okay, he's talking about his best friend Margaret, his gal pal, and then Pearl. Bruce promised Pearl he would write her frequently when he went to America, something like that. And he's outside Ruby Charles restaurant in Seattle around 1960, working as a busboy, etc. Goes into a lot of information about China, Hong Kong, etc, etc. It's Cha-Cha. Okay, must be Jesse Glover. He meets him at some demonstration. When Jesse discovered his connection to Bruce, he made sure to walk ahead of him each morning to school. Every time he passed a telephone pole, he would punch and kick it, pretending like he didn't notice Bruce behind him. For days, Jesse did this without eliciting a reaction. Finally, he screwed up his courage and asked, "Is your name Bruce Lee?" "Bruce Lee is my name. What do you want?" "Do you practice Kung Fu?" "I do." "Would you teach me?" Jesse asked, his heart in his mouth. When Bruce hesitated, Jesse continued, "I am very anxious to learn. I went to California looking for instruction, but I couldn't find anyone who would teach me." Bruce looked at Jesse for a long time, weighing the request in his mind. These were the words that Bruce had dreamed of hearing since his buddy Hawkins had cast doubt on his plans to teach Wing Chun in America. Okay, he knew he would receive criticism from conservative Chinese chauvinists like Ruby Chow. Sure enough, after she discovered Bruce had an African American student, she rebuked him. "You are teaching black guys this and that. They are going to use it to beat up on the Chinese." "It would have to be in place where we would practice in secret," Bruce finally said. "We could use my apartment," Jesse suggested. "Do you live alone?" "I have 2 roommates. They will have to leave when I teach you. I will get rid of them." Okay. Bruce gives him a lecture. They arrive at his apartment and asks him what did he do, what kind of background in the martial arts did he have, or judo, boxing, whatever. Okay, then they went through the paces, and I guess Jesse was impressed by him. Then he meets James DeMille, bit of a tough guy. Thought he could take out Bruce, apparently. Got a tap on the forehead and realised, yeah, Bruce was the real deal, real fast and all this sort of stuff. Trying to find the information on Amy Sambo, Japanese American girl that he really fell for, head over heels. It looks like he fought a Japanese guy. We'll go back a bit. Because apparently he insulted this guy. "You insulted me and my country," Yoichi declared. Bruce was furious. Jesse was afraid the fight was going to happen right away, or right there. Bruce looked away in an effort to control his rage. Yoichi kept moving into Bruce's line of vision in an attempt to break down his confidence. When the bus finally arrived, Yoichi sat in front of Bruce and started to discuss the rules in an abrasive manner. "Forget the rules," Bruce snarled, the veins in his neck bulging. "I'm going all out." "Why don't you stop talking?" Jesse said to Yoichi. "We will move to different seats." Jesse spent the rest of the trip downtown trying to calm Bruce down and get him to agree not to go all out. He was afraid Bruce might kill Yoichi. When they reached the wire, Bruce, Ed, Howard and Jesse went directly to the handball court. Yoichi and his two friends went to a bathroom where he changed into a white karate gi. Bruce tested the wood floors with his shoes and decided to go barefoot. He took off his dress shirt and did a couple of deep knee bends in his undershirt. As the two men faced off, Bruce wanted to make one thing clear. "You challenged me, right?" Yeah, Yoichi said. "You asked me for this fight?" Yeah. "All right," Bruce said. Jesse, who was the referee, stepped out to explain the rules. The fight would consist of 3 2-minute rounds, with the winner being the man who won 2 of the 3. Ed Hart, serving as timekeeper, pulled out a stopwatch. Bruce stood in a relaxed Wing Chun stance, right foot forward, right hand pointing at Yoichi's nose, left palm next to right elbow. Yoichi started in a classical karate stance with one leg extended behind him, one hand facing Bruce with palm out, the other hand in a fist chambered at his waist. "Ready, set, go," Jesse shouted. Yoichi immediately switched to cat stance, etc. Bruce Lee blasted his chest, sent him flying back 6 feet in the air, so he had that power, right? He had that power in his kicks when he was a young guy, okay? And he beat this guy up. Jesse and Ed Hart ran over to Yoichi to check his pulse. After a few minutes, he regained consciousness. The first question from Yoichi's lips was, "How long did it take me to defeat him?" Or how long did it take him, Bruce, to defeat him? Hart looked at his stopwatch. It read 11 seconds. Feeling sorry for the guy, he doubled it, 22 seconds. As Yoichi pulled himself off the floor, he said, "I want a rematch. I didn't train properly for this fight. I want to do it again." "I never wanted to fight you in the first place," Bruce replied. "There's no point in fighting you again. As far as I'm concerned, this is over. I will never talk to anyone else about what happened." As everyone left, Bruce made his friends promise they wouldn't discuss the fight with outsiders. Yoichi's buddies leaked their details to the rest of the school. To save face, Yoichi asked Bruce if he could become his disciple and take private lessons with him. Bruce told him he would have to join his club's formal class and learn with the rest of the beginners. Yoichi swallowed his pride and attended classes for a month before dropping out. A lot of people took exception to the things Bruce said, recalls Taki Kimura, one of his students and friends. But when they saw what he could do, they all wanted to join him. Okay, this guy couldn't handle the training, right? Dropped out. So he fought and beat a Japanese guy, student, whatever. Goes on about Kung Fu is Tao. During his first year in America, Bruce and his high school sweetheart Pearl, TSO, slowly grew apart. Their letters became less and less frequent. Hoping to salvage their long-distance relationship, Pearl flew to Seattle to see Bruce, but he forgot to pick her up from the airport. After waiting for hours, she grew so angry she hopped a flight to San Francisco. When Bruce realized his mistake, he made numerous phone calls to beg her forgiveness, but she refused to accept his apology. After Pearl, Bruce dated a number of young women, but none for any length of time. He was a charmer and a bit of a player. Okay, so he was a bit of a player. If a pretty girl was anywhere near, Bruce would perk up and start a spontaneous kung fu demo, says James DeMille. He would point to James and explain how fast and tough he was, and he'd probably knock him over and under. Bruce liked to take his dates to the movies. How could we let the valuable but short autumn days slip away, etc. Okay, so he was a player, like fooled around with lots of different women at that time. May have slept with them, may not have, right? Probably a flirty guy, because his whole thing would have been, his martial arts. It wasn't until his first year of college that Bruce Lee fell head over heels in love. He was lounging with friends in the student centre, the Hub, when he noticed a stunning Japanese-American sophomore named Amy Sambo sitting in the far corner. Entranced, Bruce left his friends and moved to a nearby table to get a closer look. When she walked past him to go to class, he suddenly said, "Hello," grabbed her forearm with his index finger and thumb. He squeezed with such power that Amy's knees buckled and she nearly dropped her books on the floor. So that's when he met her. That's what we were looking for. He met her. "Let go of me before I really get angry," she exclaimed. When he did, she asked, "Why did you do that?" "I was just showing my friends how much power can be exerted with only 2 fingers." "What a jerk," she said as she marched away. While not a particularly suave approach, it left an impression. Literally, the black and blue bruises on her arms lasted for days. For the next several weeks, wherever Amy went, Bruce popped up out of nowhere, trying to make it up to her. Bruce would ask, "How do you feel?" "Are you okay? My name is Bruce Lee." He would bring up any random topic of conversation just to talk to her. Bruce pursued Amy with the same single-minded devotion as he did Kung Fu perfection. In love, as in combat, his strategy was to overwhelm the target. One day, she stepped on a nail at ballet practice and needed crutches to get to class. When Bruce saw her struggling up a long flight of concrete stairs north of the football field, he ran to her and offered help, and ended up carrying her up there after ignoring her protest. What followed over the next 2 years was a tempestuous, on-again, off-again relationship. The magnetism was mutual and physical. Both of them were beautiful and both were dancers. "When I perform, it's almost orgasmic, it's very sexual," and Bruce was like that too. Amy says, "I'm horribly attracted to talent," and Bruce was a kinetic genius. He could just look at a movement and assimilate it. There, she verified that, right? As that Kung Fu master that taught him those northern Kung Fu style moves, right? And he mastered them in 3 days, which was very impossible. Most people would take months, years. Yeah. He assimilated it, he absorbed it, he became that movement. He moved in a way that no other Asians moved. When she challenged him to do a pirouette, he pulled it off in 1 try. She also teased him about the stiffness of his cha-cha. "Why don't you put a little funk into it?" After placing some R&B records on a turntable, he was quickly able to feel the music and get down. "It's very hard to teach someone that, but Bruce had it," Amy recalls. He could get funky. Everything else going on here? Bruce was so proud to be Chinese he was bursting with it. Okay, one day on campus, Bruce pulled her into an open office in Parrington Hall on the pretext that they could study together there in privacy. It turned out to belong to Theodore Rothko, the university's internationally acclaimed Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. When Rothko walked in and caught them, he declared, "I'm Rothko the poet. What are you doing in my room?" Amy froze, but Bruce stood up, walked right over to him and stuck out his hand. "I'm Bruce Shifu Lee, Kung Fu master. Good to meet you." "What is Kung Fu?" Rothko asked. Delighted by the question, Bruce went to the chalkboard and launched into a 15-minute lecture on Kung Fu, complete with diagrams and an explanation of the principles of yin and yang. Amy wanted to crawl under the door, but Rothko was mesmerized. When Bruce finished, Rothko said, "I think I understand. Thank you. Please come back anytime you want to talk more about Kung Fu." The next day, Rothko recounted the story to his class. "I met a young man, and he is supposed to be a master of the martial arts. He seemed pretty lethal." Wow. Getting that from a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, right? Brilliant. Difficulty in Bruce and Amy's relationship stemmed from their divergent upbringings. Bruce had a traditional 1950s view, etc., etc. She felt that he was suffocating her, always wanting to know where she was going, with whom, whether she wanted to go to Chinatown without him. Whenever she wanted to go to Chinatown without him, Bruce insisted that one of his Kung Fu students serve as her bodyguard. Yeah, so it's getting in the face too much, right? Bruce repeatedly asked Amy to marry him, all this sort of stuff. She believed they could be together, but she was also afraid they might kill each other. She worried he just wanted to lock her down, keep her by his side all the time. She wasn't ready for that kind of commitment, and she didn't think deep down he was ready for the responsibility. "I'm taking care of my mother who is ill," Amy said. "Are you capable of supporting us?" When she finally dumped her for good during the spring semester of 1963, Bruce was devastated. For weeks he could barely leave his room. Bruce was heartbroken, Jesse Glover recalls. He didn't do anything during this period except draw pictures of Amy and talk to his close friends about the emotions he felt. Oh, how sad. I guess he got over it eventually. He creates the Zhong Fan Kung Fu Institute after himself. A very American thing to do. He wrote a letter to his former sweetheart Pearl So, laying out the mission statement for his life. Wow. And 21-year-old Bruce Lee concluded by framing his career goals as part of a spiritual quest. He didn't just want worldly success, he also desired inner peace. And the first obstacle to Bruce's grand plan came from a senior student, Jesse Glover. He and several other original club members who were used to training with Bruce for free were put off by Bruce's efforts to formalise and commercialise his art. At first, Jesse and the others avoided Bruce's new school. I found it a little difficult to start calling someone who I had been running around with for 2 years Shifu or Sifu, Jesse says, using the Chinese word for master. Annoyed, Bruce made it clear that he wasn't going to share his secrets or reveal his best techniques to anyone who wasn't strongly in his corner. This provoked Jesse, who was almost as prideful as Bruce, to split away and take Leroy Garcia and James DeMille with him. The breakup was in many ways more painful for Bruce than the one with Amy Sambo. The rebel faction opened their own school, not a franchise of the Jun Fan Kung Fu Institute, but a competitor in the basement of the New Richmond Hotel. The market for Kung Fu in Seattle in 1962 was not big enough to support two queens, and Jesse's school closed in 5 months. He tried again, opening a second school on Pike Street in 1963. Jesse did the teaching and James DeMille was responsible for recruiting. As the school was struggling to survive with only a handful of students, DeMille made a trip to Bruce's brand new studio on the University Way with its 50 plus disciples. After the divorce, the relationship between Jesse, Jim and Bruce was overtly friendly and polite, but carried an undertow of hurt feelings and betrayal. That day, a handful of Bruce's students cornered DeMille and asked, "Why did you and Jesse stop training with Bruce?" "We didn't like some of the changes he was making," DeMille bluntly told him. "We felt like he was holding things back, leaving out important pieces of what makes his system work." That's what a lot of Kung Fu masters do, right? Or teachers do. They teach you so much, but they don't want you to beat them up, right? Or defeat them or get better than them. So they, don't tell you certain key elements, right? And he went mad when he found out, when some students told him about it. DeMille. Bruce pointed his finger to DeMille's chest and declared, "You have no right to make comments to my class." "You are right," DeMille backed down. "I'm sorry." Still furious, Bruce slapped a pair of gloves he was hiding into his open palm. He seemed ready to attack. DeMille thought to himself, to fight Bruce when he is calm is insanity, but to do it when he is mad is to invite certain death. DeMille had a handgun, a trigger of a handgun in his pocket, right? He had a handgun in his pocket. If Bruce leapt at him, DeMille planned to blow a hole in him. "I apologise again, I was wrong." "I'm sorry," DeMille said as he slowly backed away, turned around and walked out the door. It was the last time the two young men ever spoke. Could have shot him, eh? Wow, his father apologises to him for treating him like the way he did. Very, very hard on him. Because he realised what he'd become, right? He'd become somebody. Okay, and some more information here. Okay, so Bruce's taste in fashion occasionally got him into trouble. A friend said, Bruce explained to an American friend, "This is Hong Kong. They respect your clothing first before they respect you." His taste in fashion occasionally got him into trouble. One evening he went out with a female friend, Eunice Lam, to the Eagle Nest in Hilton Hotel, blah blah blah. And he was the centre of attention with his cha-cha dragon steps. On the ferry back to Kowloon, he took off his jacket, and some wannabe tough guys began to mock him, curse him for looking like a dandy. Bruce smiled at them and said, "You'd better keep your mouth shut or you'll be in trouble later." When they reached the Star Ferry Pier, the ruffians alighted first and waited near the flagpole at the corner of the pier. Bruce guided Eunice past him and toward her home. The thugs followed, taunting Bruce. "Where are you going so fast? Do you have a hurry home to Mama?" Eunice was terrified, but Bruce was calm and composed. When the thugs got too close, Bruce spun to face them. Suddenly Eunice heard screaming and looked back. One of the ruffians was on the ground grabbing his leg in terrible pain. The other was fleeing in terror. Bruce smiled at her and said, "Just treated him to my shin kick." What a cheeky guy. When Bruce's cousin Frank, who was a few years older, heard the story, he shook his head and made a joke about Bruce's growing maturity. If that had been a few years ago, Frank said, Bruce would have beaten them all up as soon as they got off the ferry. And he invites Doug Palmer, his brightest American student, to Hong Kong, visit him in Hong Kong. When Doug, who was 6'4" and 220 pounds, walked into the apartment, Bruce's entire family stood back and gasped. We had seen tall British guys before, recalls Robert, but it was like a giant came to visit. We had to let it sink in a bit. Bruce took Doug to visit a man in his apartment at the top of a high rise. He was a smiling man with a twinkle in his eyes, slight and getting on in years but still fit, recalls Doug. Before they arrived, Bruce made Doug promise that he wouldn't do or say anything to reveal he was Bruce's student. That man was old school and didn't believe Kung Fu should be taught to foreigners. As Doug sat in the corner pretending to be clueless, he had the opportunity to watch two of the most famous Kung Fu artists of the 20th century practice Chi Sao for hours in their undershirts. It was the first time Doug had ever seen Bruce unable to dominate someone. The man had it over him, man. No matter what he did, he had him all tied up and stuff. What the heck's this? Oh, so he did get circumcised, according to Doug. His brother. Ask him, how does it feel? It doesn't hurt. Looking at the bandages, etc. Ooh, it's in pain, eh? Come back in pain after 15 minutes walk. At the end of July, as Doug and Bruce packed to leave, Bruce and Hoi Chin, his father, hugged, the reconciliation complete. It was the last time Bruce would see his father alive. Sunny side of the bay. Linda Emery, his wife, right, how he met her. She briefly dated a half-Japanese boy in high school until her mother found out and forbade her. It was okay for Linda to have Asian girlfriends but not boyfriends. Okay. One day during her senior year, Linda was hanging by the lockers with Sue Ann and some of her cheerleading friends when a former homecoming queen swept into the school, Amy Sambo. On her arm was a deliciously handsome young man wearing a custom-tailored black suit, skinny black tie, shimmering purple shirt, a hat with a skinny brim, and a long beige coat. The sight of Amy and her dashing new boyfriend set envious tongues wagging, especially among the clique of cheerleaders at the end of the hallway. "Who is that?" asked Linda. "Oh, that's Bruce Lee," answered Sue Ann Kay. "Isn't he beautiful?" Yeah, the cheerleaders collectively swooned. "It's like he walked straight out of West Side Story," one of them giggled. "Yes, he looks like George Chakiris," said Linda. "Suave, debonair, big city. He's here to lecture in Mr. Wilson's class on Chinese philosophy," Sue Ann said. "How do you know?" Linda asked. "I take Kung Fu lessons from him." The girls burst out laughing. "I bet. Is that what you call it?" Linda's eyes followed Bruce as he walked down the hall, laughing and talking and throwing playful punches with some of the kids. She was more than a little impressed. That summer, Linda took a job with her mum at Sears, etc., etc. She would tease her friend about a dreamy Kung Fu teacher. "Is he why you are studying all that strange self-defense stuff? Why don't you come to a lesson with me and let's see what it's like?" Sue added, and did. So she probably did. Okay, then, like that Dragon Lee, Bruce Lee story, she gets invited to an expensive place for dinner or something, right? Nah, only you and me, he replied. Stunned, she was only able to nod in response. Wow. Went to the Space Needle or something like that. Pulled up in his car, souped up 57 Ford. Steve McQueen and all that. Like, he'd say to him, pull up. You know, he couldn't really control a car, fast car, all that sort of stuff. Steve McQueen took him before a ride down the highway. You know, floored it, and Bruce Lee was like nuts because, you know, he could have killed us, man. He was hiding, carrying, pretty much under the dashboard. And Steve McQueen did it for a joke, scared the shit out of him, right? And every time he pulled up in his car, on the sidewalk and stuff, he said, "Hey Chuck, let's go do this." Or Bob, let's go do this, right? And they go make excuses. "Oh no, I got a class to teach." "Oh no, I got to go home and look after my sick mother," all that sort of stuff, right? Because they knew he was like a badass driver, you know. He wasn't a very good driver. So he's with Linda. He's got to know that Amy Sambo. Okay. James Lynn Yim Lee, one of his students, a hard man, a hard drinker, and a fighter. A gymnast, a weightlifter, and amateur boxer. Oh wow. Throughout his 20s and 30s, he studied jiu-jitsu and Silum Kung Fu. Wow. His specialty was iron palm. You can stack up 5 bricks, ask you which one you wanted him to break, and then shatter your pick while leaving the rest intact. Ooh, bit of a Frank Dukes, John Claude Van Damme. Eh? Al Novak. I wonder if he's related to that guy. There's a Kim Novak, the guy in Game of Death that played Stick. Yeah? Looking at who's this Ellen Joe? Oh, okay, she had bodybuilding and stuff. Interest. Okay. So befriends this Ellen person. Something about a book, Chinese Kung Fu, philosophical art of self-defense. Was just the clever saying? It cost $600 to print 1,000 copies, which James sold through his mail order business for $5. Profits from the book helped Bruce pay off various expenses. His primary reason for doing the book was that he needed the money, Jesse says. The secondary reason was to declare war on traditional Kung Fu styles. James was still furious that his older master, T.Y. Wong, had accused James of stiffing him. But he was even angrier than everything he had learned from what T.Y. Wong was useless against Bruce's more modern approach. Jimmy spent years training in classical Kung Fu, says Gary Kaganan, a long-time student of James, and he felt after having met and trained with Bruce that he wasted precious years learning sets and forms, not learning how to fight. It's like that Bruce Lee clone, Bruce Leong, what his name is. He's been taught by these 2 supposed masters, elephant trunk, fish in water, all this sort of crap, right? And he went up against some villainous Kung Fu master and got his ass kicked heaps of times. And he figured out, well, your Kung Fu is crap, right? And then they done dirty on him and joined up with this villainous Kung Fu master that he kept getting hiding from, until he meets the blind man, Simon Yun or something, and learns real Kung Fu. Okay. This is a really interesting book. Okay. goes deeper into what he set himself and what he achieved. Okay, this is when they meet the mother, right? And he states, "I want to marry your daughter. We are leaving on Monday." Bruce declared to her hostile family, "I'm Chinese, by the way." The joke didn't lighten the mood. Race was the underlying issue for the family and the country.